NATO is fighting this war without ever declaring one. The war in Ukraine is often described as a fight between two nations, but in reality, it has become one of the most significant tests of global military alliances since the Cold War. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, NATO did not enter the war directly. No alliance troops crossed the border. No NATO jets enforced a no-fly zone. Instead, something far more complex began to unfold. A modern proxy conflict, fought with weapons, intelligence, money, and logistics, without officially declaring war. To understand NATO's role, you have to go back further than 2022. The relationship between Ukraine and NATO didn't begin with the invasion. It began decades earlier, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Ukraine gained independence. For years, it balanced between Russia and the West, trying to avoid choosing sides. That balance collapsed in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. That moment changed everything. NATO condemned the annexation, increased its military presence along its eastern flank, and began expanding cooperation with Ukraine. Training programs were established. Joint exercises increased. Ukraine was not a NATO member, but it was no longer neutral. When the full-scale invasion began in 2022, NATO faced a critical decision. Direct intervention risked a wider war with a nuclear power. Doing nothing risked the collapse of Ukraine and instability across Europe. So, NATO chose a third option: support, without direct combat. Within days, weapons began flowing in. At first, defensive systems, anti-tank missiles, air defense equipment, medical supplies. Javelins and NLAWs became symbols of Ukraine's early resistance. As the war escalated, so did the support. Heavy artillery followed, then long-range rocket systems, then advanced air defense capable of intercepting cruise missiles and drones. This wasn't random aid. It was coordinated through NATO logistics hubs, intelligence sharing networks, and multinational defense planning. Behind the scenes, NATO aircraft conducted surveillance near Ukraine's borders. Satellites tracked Russian troop movements. Signals intelligence intercepted communications. Ukraine was receiving battlefield awareness at a level it had never possessed before. That intelligence advantage allowed Ukrainian forces to anticipate attacks, reinforce weak points, and strike critical targets. Most of this assistance was never officially acknowledged. Silence was intentional. NATO was walking a tightrope, helping Ukraine survive without becoming a direct participant. As months passed, Western support crossed new thresholds. Ukraine began receiving modern tanks, then longer-range missiles, then training programs for advanced fighter aircraft. Each step represented a policy shift. Weapons once considered too escalatory slowly became acceptable. This escalation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, calculated, and deliberate. NATO leaders understood that moving too fast could provoke unpredictable retaliation. Instead, they increased support in stages, watching Russia's response, then adjusting. At the same time, NATO strengthened its own defenses. Thousands of additional troops were deployed to Eastern Europe. Battle groups were established in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. Large-scale military exercises became routine again. This wasn't just about Ukraine, it was deterrence. A message that while NATO would not fight Russia inside Ukraine, it would defend every inch of alliance territory. One of the biggest shifts came with NATO expansion. Finland and Sweden, nations that had remained neutral for decades, applied for membership after the invasion. Finland, sharing a long border with Russia, joined first. The strategic map of Europe changed overnight. Russia's attempt to push NATO back had instead pulled it closer. Meanwhile, the cost of support grew. Hundreds of billions of dollars were committed to weapons, training, logistics, and humanitarian aid. Defense industries ramped up production at levels unseen since the Cold War. Artillery shells, missiles, drones, modern warfare was consuming resources faster than expected. This exposed a harsh reality. Many NATO countries were not prepared for a prolonged, high-intensity conflict. Stockpiles ran low. Production struggled to keep pace. Yet the support continued, because the stakes went far beyond Ukraine. For NATO, this war became a test of credibility. If Ukraine collapsed despite years of backing, what would that signal to allies elsewhere, to adversaries watching closely? The war also reshaped military doctrine. Drone warfare, electronic warfare, and precision strikes redefined how battles are fought. NATO forces studied Ukraine in real time, adapting strategy based on what worked and what failed. Ukraine became both a battlefield and a proving ground. But there were limits. NATO repeatedly emphasized it would not send troops, no matter the pressure, no matter the provocation. That restraint frustrated some and reassured others. It preserved a fragile balance, helping Ukraine fight without triggering a larger war. As the conflict dragged on, political divisions emerged inside NATO countries. Public support fluctuated, economic pressure mounted, energy prices rose, budgets tightened, questions grew louder. How long could this continue? Yet the alliance held, because this war was never just about land. It was about whether borders can be changed by force, about whether alliances still matter, about whether security guarantees mean anything in the modern world. Ukraine became the front line of that question. A nation fighting with Western weapons, Western intelligence, and Western backing, but with its own people paying the cost. For NATO, this war rewrote the rules. It showed alliances can shape wars without officially entering them. That power can be projected through logistics, intelligence, and restraint. That modern conflict is as much about silence as it is about firepower, and the outcome is still uncertain. But one thing is clear: NATO is no longer a background player in European security. It is once again a central force, adapting, expanding, and preparing for a world where large-scale war is no longer unthinkable. And Ukraine stands at the center of it all, not as a NATO member, not as a proxy, but as the battlefield where the future of global alliances is being tested, one shipment, one decision, one silent calculation at a time. If you want real war stories most people never hear, subscribe to Shadows of War, because some battles are fought in silence,